Episode 17, House of the Waiting Family. From the very first exchange between Ed and Armstrong, this episode immediately frames what it's going to be about. It's been 4 years since Ed and Al have started their quest for the Philosopher's Stone, and in all of that time they've never visited once. And the real kicker is when Ed says that it's because they don't have a family waiting for them. On the surface, it may seem like the only dramatic purpose behind this line is to point attention towards Winry and Pinocchio, and this does come back up at the end of the episode, but it's also sad for less obvious reasons, because it feels like a part of Ed feels proud to say something like that. He burned down his house so that he'd never look back, and felt ashamed when Winry discovered that in actuality that was all he was doing with the inscription in his pocket watch. This moment sheds light on one of Ed's biggest flaws in the show. He thinks that there's no point in looking back, being regretful, or even having basic human emotions like being sad enough to cry. He sees all of those sentimental feelings he has as wasteful, which is why he tries so hard to hide all of those moments of vulnerability from the people around him and in the audience. I love everything about this scene, from minor details like the fact that they changed the placement of the scene in the manga, making for an infinitely more appropriate setting for this to happen, to the really sad way the camera holds on and zooms out of the shot briefly after Winry says that she's crying for Ed and Al because neither of them really can. By the way the scene is framed, Ed is clearly in the wrong here for having such a narrow-minded perspective. There's something powerful about Ed's silence as he listens to Winry's quiet sobs, because he doesn't really have a good response for what she just said. Up until this point, Ed and Al have gone through a lot of traumatic shit, so this episode not only serves as a nice breather for our two leads, but it also gives us the chance to really see who they are as people. Ed's this snarky, distrustful, and abrasive kid, but as soon as we get to Risen Bowl, you really get the sense that every bit of edge to him is stripped away as he allows himself to be drawn in by the serene atmosphere of the place. Even his whole short gag is shown to just be another overblown bit that he does with someone he's very familiar with. It does feel like a genuine reaction to other people though, which is probably why it started out as that one thing you do ironically, and then after a while it just becomes a habit. He still feels like the same person, but just a lot less afraid of showing sincere emotion and affection for the people he cares about. But what's most important about this episode is that it allows Ed to reflect on the event that started his journey. While Ed is waiting for his new automail, he finds himself in this incredibly relatable scene. He has nothing to do, so he starts to get restless. He flails around and complains about the situation, completely forgetting that there was something important that he neglected to tend to, which he's forced to recognize after Al reminds him.
Brother, I've been thinking, maybe you should visit Mom.
You mean go to her grave?
Yeah, no shit, Al should have beat the shit out of him after he said that. That line was unnecessary, but every other aspect of the scene is very nice. It's quiet, there are birds chirping in the background, and it all contributes to this very lazy feeling that Ed is experiencing. It's a relatable moment because even though he knows he should do it, there's a part of him that doesn't want to, like me when I was making this video. You can tell that he's kind of hesitating to visit his mother's grave by the way the shot is framed. We don't see his face, we only see his unchanging body in a resting position. It conveys this sense of unwillingness perfectly, and when we see him get up, we still don't see his face, which shows that even when he's resolved to go, he still has to force himself to do it. While one element of this scene is a bit on the nose, the most important parts of it, the emotions that Ed is experiencing, is shown to the audience visually. Also, I just liked the way that he reacted to what Al said at first. It would have been perfect if they had just cut this line out. Anyways, he hesitated before coming here for a good reason, because holy shit, this place is lonely. There's a wide top-down shot with Ed and Den barely taking up any space on the screen, and the only company they have is a bunch of gravestones. This red sunset looks beautiful as always and adds that wistful feel to what we're seeing combined with the music in the background. I really like the way that it flashes between Ed's face as a child with this grim and determined look on his face, and now with a calm and reflective one. It perfectly captures the change in his outlook on life as he grew older. But Den really isn't feeling this reflective moment. He starts to whine and goes, "I'm fucking hungry, bitch." So Ed just goes back home, which makes the scene feel kind of incomplete. It's similar to another scene with both of the brothers later in this episode, specifically this one of Al beating around the bush when asking Ed about his missing memories. The presentation here is top notch. Like the rest of the episode, it's quiet and reflective, but in a more uncomfortable way. I like how Ed enters the frame speaking enthusiastically about his new automail at the beginning, and Al responds to what he says very succinctly, which makes Ed aware of the uneasy atmosphere of the moment. At a certain point, the show cuts to a shot that reminds me of a similar one from episode 9, of Ed and Al sitting on the train. Both of these emphasize the emptiness of the room aside from the space that the main characters take up, and they both indicate how much these brothers mean to each other and how all they have is each other. But that makes for a much darker implication here. Because of how much Ed means to Al, it's all the more disturbing to find out that everything between them might have been fabricated. As the two of them are talking, we zoom out to see that the door is open, when Ed closed it at the beginning of the scene, which means that Armstrong opened it quietly so as not to interrupt their talk. I like that he does that. He waits for the right moment to come into the room, which is when it gets awkward between Ed and Al, as opposed to just dancing to the beat of his own drum. I like this shot of Armstrong walking in front of Ed and Al, obscuring them from the camera, and literally shifting the direction and topic of the scene. By the end of the scene, you can tell that there are still still some doubts in Al's mind, but he decides to put those doubts aside for now, which again results in this incomplete feeling. But that makes for an amazing payoff to this episode as it ends with yet another moment of reflection. This time though, there are no distractions. The two brothers are allowed to get sentimental, and they're allowed to reminisce about their childhood fully. Except this time there's a much warmer feel to it all. I especially like the shot of Al's feet moving further and further into the room as he talks about the layout and where everything was. It feels so natural as he progresses through the rubble, like it's all coming back to him slowly, and it's very nice. What's also very nice is that by the end, this episode comes full circle. Ed learns that there's nothing wrong or wasteful about being sentimental or looking back, as he puts it. It's something that everybody needs to do sometimes. This is portrayed very nicely by the light that Winry shines through the night, just like Ed's mom used to. Ed's smile in reaction to that is freaking beautiful storytelling, as is Winry's reaction to hearing him call Risenbull home sweet home. Perfect 10 out of 10 episode. This is some of the best stuff 2003 has to offer. Episode 18, Marco's Notes. This episode is a lot harder to talk about than something like the last one because while it's well made, it's not as showy as some of the moments from House of the Waiting Family. Take the confrontation between Lust and Scar that starts off this episode. It's a scene that establishes tension really well with quiet but unnerving music in the background and the cramped feeling of the dark library. It's an understated bit of direction that might be glossed over, especially when compared to the incredibly heart-wrenching scenes of the previous episode. As a side note, I really like how this show moved the fight that Scar, Lust, and Gluttony had in the sewers to the library because it kills two birds with one stone. This fight doesn't serve much of a purpose in the manga other than it's kind of cool, but by changing the setting, this sets into motion the main obstacle the brothers have to deal with in this episode while having the same effect the manga had. Also, this fight is just really cool. The animation is great, all the characters look awesome, and there are some really badass shots here. I particularly like the shot of Lust looking at the camera and then throwing away her torch before charging forward. Everything about this fight is freaking amazing. Anyways, after this, we go to a scene of Ed, Al, and Armstrong getting off the train. I like these shots of Ed and Al running excitedly while Armstrong calmly lingers behind. He looks like their dad or something, and the way Ed talks to him with this big smile is really nice when you look at how the relationship started out. I like the shot of the three approaching the camera as Maria, Ross, and Brosh.
I'm Sergeant Denny Block, humbly at your service.
Block?
Let Block and me be your eyes on the ground.
Hold on. I like the shot of the three approaching the camera as Maria, Ross, and Brosh slowly enter the frame. This shot feels really open and free until you see their disgusting arms and all of a sudden everything seems so narrow and claustrophobic. This is probably how Ed feels being assigned some bodyguards when he's just trying to do his own thing. He's always working with restrictions. It's like your boss telling you that he's going to give you complete control over a project and then giving you a bunch of stupid limitations to work with. A minor thing about this scene that I want to mention is that it's an example of why I think the short gag in this version of the story is actually funny, aside from the fact that Ed's height is actually used as a part of his character growth in the 2003 adaptation. The animators actually went through the effort of drawing an entirely different and extremely detailed facial expression for this one scene. He's also not yelling at the top of his lungs or anything, he's just kind of done with life here. He doesn't just have the same reaction every time, so this bit doesn't come off as tiresome or lazy. The scene where they introduce Maria Ross is just A+ visual storytelling. When they mistake Al for the Full Metal Alchemist and they find out that Ed is actually the guy that they should be respecting, Ross's reaction is a lot more restrained than a lot of the other characters who have been in the same situation. She's definitely taken aback, but the show frames this as something serious, not something to laugh at like the way that Brosh reacts here. Here, Ross realizes that the Full Metal Alchemist is just a kid, someone who's frail and needs to be protected, a big difference from the hulking figure she was probably led to believe by his title. She takes her job seriously, but Ed dismisses her, which gives the two a rocky start to their relationship. These lingering shots of Maria Ross after her first interaction with Ed tells you everything you need to know about how she sees him now. The show pretty cleverly weaves in themes of childhood and adulthood into the storyline. Maria Ross learns that while the Elric brothers are children, it's not a good thing to coddle them. The message being taught to her is summed up pretty nicely by Hughes, who says that it's an adult's job to enable children because they're the future. In the end, she leaves the brothers to do as they please, supporting them rather than restricting them. It's a really simple step that she takes, but conveyed very effectively with the amount of time dedicated to this. The process of getting Marco's research notes is really clever. When we talked about episode 7, we made note of how effectively the show plants minor characters characters into the story and sets things up for later. Sheska is a good example of this, since not only is this an example of, hey look, that girl we saw in a previous episode is coming back and playing a larger role this time, but it's also used as a means of smartly progressing the plot of this episode and making things feel more tightly written. In the manga, when the two librarians bring up Sheska, it feels like a plausible but slightly random solution to the problem, but in the 2003 adaptation, it feels a lot more organic since Sheska was actually brought to our attention before. Sheska is a pretty colorful character and her introduction is funny, her odd nature being used to great comedic effect when juxtaposed against Ed and Al's very real depression over finding out that Marco's notes were gone. Something minor I like about the scene of these four trying to dig out Sheska from this enormous pile of books is that while Ed, Al, and Brasha are all just frantically digging through the books, Roz conducts herself in an orderly manner still. The show doesn't make a big deal out of it, but this is a great moment that solidifies what kind of personality she has. I love how darkly hilarious the scene that follows this is. Ed goes back to the library and attempts to transmute the books back to their original form, only for the ashes of those books to be blown away by a random gust of wind. The setup for this joke just feels so organic for this world, and even though it's meant to be funny, it actually contributes to a feeling that the brothers have dealt with for the majority of this story. That feeling of being strung along on a never-ending goose chase with every lead turning out to be useless, and that's a feeling that this episode continuously gives you. Every time Ed is given a slight glimmer of hope, it's immediately taken away from him. He starts looking forward to seeing Marco's research notes, only to discover that the library storing those notes has burned down. He learns about someone who could confirm that Marco's notes were safe, only for that person to confirm the opposite. He tries to restore the burned books to how they were before, only for the wind to blow away the ashes of those books. He learns that Sheska memorized everything in Marco's book and makes a copy of it word for word, only to reveal that it was an ordinary cookbook the whole time, and finally he realizes that Marco wrote his notes in a code for them to decipher, so they spend an entire day digging through book after book to find the truth. This is told to the audience through a very efficient montage, which has a cute little joke that pokes fun at Ross and Brasha's relationship. The brothers are even interrupted during this process and are forced to deal with a distraction that has nothing to do with what they were doing, because of how overprotective Ross is trying to be during this part of the episode. So they actually sink multiple days into this, all that time and effort only for it to turn out that the Philosopher's Stone required a secret ingredient so morally reprehensible and horrific that it destroys their motivation to even go after the damn thing. I love the way they draw Ed's face here. The emotions he's feeling in this moment are palpable. This overhead shot of Ed and Al as it slowly zooms out to reveal more and more of the room is also really great. As it zooms out, you can see just how much work they've done to get to this point. It also emphasizes how small they are and how this quest for the stone has suddenly become much bigger than just the two of them. And something else I really like is that in this version of the story, Maria Ross doesn't find out about the stone because Ed told her about it. She finds out because she was eavesdropping on Ed and Al's conversation, which makes a lot more sense given how Ed didn't want anybody to know about this really. I realize I didn't talk much about what happened to Scar after his fight with Lust. This is a nice atmospheric moment for Scar and an interesting one at that because we get to see him take a bit of a breather as opposed to just fighting. I like how serene everything here is. The very nice and relaxed atmosphere of the village provides a good contrast with the unveiling of the secret Krabby Patty formula in the library, and the episode ends on this kid getting off to Scar's sexy tattoos. Yeah, your tattoo give me boner. 9 out of 10, great episode. Episode 19, The Truth Behind Truths. This episode starts off with Al giving the audience a bone-chilling description of the mythical power of the Philosopher's Stone, which is terrifying considering what we learned about it in the previous episode. I like how the camera pans over all of the characters' reactions to learning about this as the bell chimes in the background. It adds a hell of a lot to the very haunting nature of the scene. I love the sound design of this scene of Ed and Al sulking. Look at how they use the fan here. The scene overall is very quiet. There's no music, and at first no one is talking. These two characters are just left alone to deal with their own thoughts. The fan, on the other hand, is actually jarringly loud. This shot of Ed's face with the noise of the fan in the background always stood out to me. It gives the impression that the fan is intruding on his thoughts. The same is true for this shot of Al sitting behind the couch. It seems pretty annoying to listen to, especially over an extended period of time that's supposed to be used for reflection. Using this is a great way to set up the atmosphere of the scene and convey how demoralizing the events that happened in the last episode were for the main characters. And this is all without even using dialogue. Eventually, Ed does start speaking and summing up exactly what's so irritating about the situation, but before he does, the show lets the scene speak for itself, and when he does start his brief monologue, what he says is just top-notch writing. I like the repetition of this shot of the fan after this scene too. The few changes indicate that some time has passed, quite a considerable amount actually. The light coming from the window in the previous scene indicates that the sun is still up, although it is starting to set, and the first thing we see in this scene is the night sky. Not a lot of people might notice this considering it goes by pretty quickly, but it's conveyed through a couple of simple changes to the scene. The light is on, Al is gathering the notes on the table, and Ed has shifted into a different position than when we last saw him. So you can see what's changed despite the fact that not much really has. There's no difference in the tone of the scene. You can still see every bit of dejection from the previous one, just in a more understated way now. After all, it can't be easy for him to get over a massive roadblock like this, especially when he started out so enthusiastic about the whole thing. This is an obvious thing, but the show uses these little shifts in Ed's body to show his frustration with the situation instead of having him telling us about it in dialogue, and that's good. This is the first time we've seen Ed lash out at his brother in a serious way, and they really nailed how awkward this stuff can be. Once Ed finally explodes and breaks the cup, every shot is framed at an angle as opposed to the ordinary framing of the previous shots, and the two break into dead silence as the papers fall to the floor. The way the cup breaks is just tragic. It smashes on Al's face, again making a note of his body, and Ed reacts with a mixture of shock and instant regret. It's honestly kind of hard to watch with how afraid Al is in the scene and the dead silence that immediately follows the cup breaking. Once Maria Ross starts picking up the notes, the framing of the scene returns to normal, a pretty clever way of indicating the impact that Maria Ross had on Ed here. This scene does a really good job at the whole uplifting pep talk thing. Obviously, what Maria Ross says here is great, and I love how Ed reacts to it, but the thing that really sells it is the music that the show used here. It starts off sounding like something you'd hear after learning you have lung cancer, like my brother did.
I know it was uncalled for, but I was listening through the door.
Which fits given the fact that Maria is confronting Ed about his fear that everything he did was for nothing, but when she says this,
Why don't you try searching a little longer, Ed, but without worries about the final result?
the music takes a more hopeful tone. It's in this organic shift in not only the characters, but also the scene itself that always does it for me. It's a track that captures a lot of what I love about the show. A lot of bleak stuff happens, but there's always a bright side, an optimistic outlook on life, and I appreciate that. A minor thing about the scene is that the sound of the fan never disappears even when the scene shifts to a brighter tone. It just doesn't seem as loud because you're focusing on other things at this point. It's stuff like this that goes a long way and makes elements of a scene feel organic and not just something added in to get some kind of reaction out of the audience. I didn't even notice this until my most recent rewatch, which shows how seamless the incorporation of this fan was. You ever have that moment where something is going wrong and little noises that you wouldn't normally pay attention to start to claw at the back of your mind? Well, that's something that happens to me a lot. I like how after that talk, Ross and Brosh are included in Ed and Al's investigation. It's a nice and easy way to visually show that Ed trusts them more now. Their relationship has changed and it's effectively shown to the audience in a short amount of time. Speaking of change, Maria Ross. She's now supporting Ed and Al, but she's still overprotective of them and tries to stop them from going to Lab 5 after Ed deems it suspicious, instead offering to go in his stead. Likewise, Ed respects Ross more now, given the fact that he doesn't outright argue with her in this scene, but he still disobeys her and sneaks out on his own. I really like this scene of Ed and Al sneaking out. It's this cute little beat that makes me smile whenever I see it. It also implies something pretty endearing about Ed and Ross's relationship. He's sneaking out instead of openly defying Ross, which means Ed's trying to go about his business in a way that won't hurt her. It's like a kid trying not to wake up his mom when he's sneaking out and going to a party and probably doing drugs. I like that they still don't fully see eye to eye yet. It's an imperfect relationship, but they're definitely getting somewhere. When the two brothers arrive at Lab 5, something's immediately off with all the tripwires and security for this seemingly abandoned facility. I like how Ed and Al waste no time trying to find a way in after seeing that. Unbeknownst to them though, there's somebody watching them. It's something that a lot of people take for granted, but stuff like this is classic suspenseful storytelling.
I hate to say it, but you can't fight convenience. It's times like these I'm glad not to have an arm and leg made of flesh and blood.
I like this line, but it just feels so morbid. Like, it's times like these I'm glad I performed a satanic ritual to try and bring my dead mother back to life. While Ed and Al are doing their thing at Lab 5, Scar's tearing shit up back at the library. I like how when he bursts into the room, they use the same shot from when Ed and Al were sneaking out, just in reverse. It shows just how differently Scar sees things from the audience. When he enters, the first thing he sees is the open window and rope, and then the desk with the papers, which is the reverse order we saw things in. Makes sense considering he's mainly a warrior and preoccupied with killing someone. What the fuck? This is somewhat justified by the scene of Scar's arm reacting to Marco's stone, but at the end of the day, they didn't need to include this. All they needed to do was have Scar notice the circle around Lab 5 and get chased out. Doing something like this only adds in confusing elements, which is best to just avoid. I mean, the scene overall is good though. It gives context to Scar's actions so they can pay that off in a future episode while also just making things more tense in general. This is a minor thing, but I like Ross's reaction to seeing the rope hanging from the window. She's kind of hurt that Ed lied to her, but I also think there's a bit of relief in her voice and expression because Scar couldn't get to him. I like the scene sequence of Ed activating a bunch of booby traps, the over-the-top reactions and the still frames with the energetic music in the background makes for a nice bit of comedy while being a really fun way of conveying just how heavily guarded this place is. Specifically, this part where Ed rolls to the side in order to avoid the path of the boulder is great. The dimensions change to squish everything together to show just how cramped this is for Ed, and the wacky camera zoom makes this even better. The expression on Ed's face after the boulder passes just says it all, really. I like the shot of the two mysterious figures watching everything that's happening from a dark room where the only light comes from the cameras. It does a really good job of creating this ominous feeling and building them up as genuine threats, although I really wish they had stuck with this creepy tone for one of these figures during a later scene. It's at this point in the episode that Ed and Al meet the people guarding this place, and everything about these introductions is great. They give the audience the perfect first impressions of these two villains. This more so applies to Slicer since the majority of this ending scene focuses on the beginning of his fight with Ed. The scenes of them talking before the fight do an incredible job of building tension, and the animation here is really slick. This POV shot of Ed running towards the camera looks so fucking cool. Now moving on to Barry. The way he dies here with this crazy scream makes him seem unhinged in a way that's threatening and not incredibly silly and something to scoff at. That's foreshadowing for something later. 9 out of 10, another great episode. Episode 20, Soul of the Guardian. For some reason, this episode starts with a recap segment that the rest of the episode so far didn't have, at least I don't think it did. I might have wiped it from my memory or something though. They just take the last 2 minutes of the previous episode and put it at the beginning of this one. I guess if they didn't do this, it would have thrown off the pacing for this episode. I don't know, it's just weird. The rest of the episode is pretty great though. It's almost entirely dedicated to Ed's fight with Slicer, with a few cuts to Al dealing with Barry. Although there are some moments that feel out of place to me, like this part where Slicer tells Ed about how he used to be a prisoner and in official records he was executed 2 years ago, and then we hear Ed's thoughts talking about the link between Lab 5 and the prison next door. In any other shonen anime this wouldn't be too noticeable since a lot of battle shonen are chock full of inner monologues, but in this show we don't really hear the characters' thoughts too much, at least up to this point in the story. I don't remember if there was a single time other than this moment where that was the case. It was either the characters were literally talking or just reacting visually to something. So when Ed thought this, it took me completely by surprise. It actually happens a bit in this episode, but I got used to it after a while. I like this shot of Slicer's foot as he prepares to charge at Ed. Perfectly conveys his thought process in this moment in a way that feels cinematic and adds a bit more tension to this fight before it actually begins. There's so many shots that I can point to that do this. The animators nailed every single aspect of this setup. Every movement, angle, and camera pan has so much weight and adds so much suspense. And once the two actually start fighting, it pays off that suspense in spades. It's just a good sword fight with weighty and satisfying animation paired with just as incredible sound design and choreography. Slicer really kept me on the edge of my seat while watching this again. Some of his attacks have a lengthy wind-up to leave a bigger impact on the audience, but it's these moments where he's just really going in quickly and effectively that makes me think he's a legitimate threat. He is not giving this kid a break. Holy shit. When he's really trying to kill Ed here, you can really feel it, which makes the moments where he actually does give Ed a chance to breathe so much cooler, like he's playing with his food and he can finish the fight at any time he likes. Here's another really great moment. When Ed is transmuting a spear, the camera doesn't show Slicer approaching. Instead, it holds on the shot and just shows Ed reacting to it. The way the camera is framed puts us directly in Ed's shoes. Slicer is lightning fast and we don't even see him coming. By the time we see him again, he's already swung his sword. The show portrays the power dynamic in this fight exceptionally well. Throughout this entire fight, Slicer feels in full control and Ed seems truly cornered. But Ed does what he does best and uses his smarts to get out of the tough situation. I like how when Ed thinks he's won, he gets really cocky, starts holding Slicer's head by the strand, starts acting like he's hot shit. He's shown to have a lot more personality in this version of the story than the other two. And then when it's revealed that Slicer had a brother and he gets cornered again, they cut to this badass shot of Scar looming over him to show what he has to do. This was a really clever way for Ed to get out of this situation. Since transmuting a weapon takes too long, he has to find an easier way to get the job done, and the method he uses is foreshadowed very effectively with Scar and the established rules of alchemy. So this doesn't come off as a pull something out of your ass moment. The way the scene is presented is freaking awesome. This character shot of Ed is great. The way the camera blurs every so often to show Ed slowly losing consciousness is also great. The dialogue is great. Everything about this is great. Everything about Ed's fight with Slicer is brilliant. What's not so good is what happens with Al in this episode. During the fight, the show decides to give the audience a break with some comic relief of Al just demolishing Barry instead of taking him seriously. And here's where I start to get some mixed feelings with this episode. On its own, I like the jokes here. The fact that Barry was portrayed as someone to be feared at the end of the last episode, only for him to be easily taken care of in this one, is a nice setup and punchline. There's some really good slapstick comedy here too, like how whenever Al hits Barry back, he does it in the same way each time. There are also some really fun exchanges of dialogue and visual gags, and the scene comes to an end with one of the greatest one-liners in all of fiction.
You can't do that because you don't have a knife! Ah!
Why do I have to get the crazy one?
All of this would be great if not for the fact that they try to use Barry in a jarringly serious way to deeply affect Al's mental state and relationship with his brother. Al's sudden existential crisis is a plot point in the show that I am not the biggest fan of. It's not really that great in any version of the story, but here it does have some things going for it. The way the show tied in the storyline to episode 17 is great setup. The way they presented this beat was also incredibly well done in that episode. But the moment where everything goes wrong is this kind of laughable scene of Barry telling Al that everything between him and his brother is a lie. It's something that's treated as a pretty big deal, and it has this level of gravitas that doesn't really fit. Although Barry was seriously scary in the episode he was introduced in, all he's done in this one is fail miserably. It takes some serious work to build up a character as a threat, but not nearly as much as it does to absolutely destroy any sense of fear that the audience had in that character. It's one of the few times 2003 doesn't make a good change to what happened in the manga, and it clashes with the rest of the story as a result. The solution may simply be for the show to present Barry in the same way as they did in episode 8, because with that more serious version of the character, the scene of him fucking with Al would feel a lot more justified. But even if they did that, there comes another problem. The dub. The dub for FMA 2003 is great, and it might be my favorite dub ever, but this moment is so goofy because all of a sudden Al starts screaming out of nowhere with brothers playing in the background, and it's all such an extreme reaction for him to have. As it is now, I still kind of appreciate what this scene is going for. It goes back and forth between the two brothers. Ed, after defeating Slicer, refuses to call him an object, as in doing so, he would also have to do the same for Al, whereas Al is going through a world-shattering experience and starting to doubt the person he trusts most. Showing the juxtaposition of these two scenes and the different emotions taking place in both of them makes for a potentially really powerful moment. This is a heavily flawed moment in the story, but even knowing that, I still kind of get chills watching the scene, because the contrast being shown here is actually interesting. It also helps that what happens in Ed's portion of the sequence is genuinely good, so it helps bring up my overall estimation of this bit. I just wish I didn't have to feel a slight shame while saying that. My stance on this is that the people behind the show definitely did try to flesh out the story beat, and they succeeded at building it up, but the follow-through was a bit weak and felt a little clumsy, and that's not even getting into the worst part of the storyline. Though, the majority of this episode is good. Overall, I give this one an 8 out of 10. Very solid, but a few issues that keep it from getting a higher score. That's all for today, and I'll be going now.